We're going to look at a particularly difficult subject today, the changing role of the sovereign nation state. Today across the globe we've got around 202 sovereign nation states. What's a sovereign nation state? People, bandy about the term constantly. Well, obviously a sovereign nation state is basically a specific area of land and sea which is controlled by a particular group. It's very simple. Historically, the state had one role and one role only. And that role was to maintain the authority of the group of people or individual who controlled and owned that particular piece of land. And obviously a sovereign nation state is based on the monopoly on the use of force through a legal system, through a police force, through the armed services. Now historically, for thousands of years, human beings, apart from many First Nations people who have a different idea of what a nation state is, controlled that area by force. Now sometimes you had a common language, a common culture, and if you've got a common language and a common culture, it helps to maintain the territorial integrity of a particular area, because you can use that common language and common culture and common system of government as a mechanism via which to differentiate yourself from those around you and create a mechanism and a culture via which you believe that that particular sovereign nation state is exceptional. Historically, that monopoly on the use of force by kings and queens and emperors, once we move into an agricultural and settled phase of human development, has been challenged only recently, only in the last 200 years. And that challenge revolved around individual human rights. Not just rights in terms of freedoms, but rights in terms of access to property and wealth. In the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century was the age of reform and revolution. Initially in the Western world, and then the rest of the world. And we saw the evolution of a variety of nation states. Some, like Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, were dictatorships. Others were parliamentary democracies. Some continued to be hereditary monarchs. But the difference was, whether it was a dictatorship or a democracy or a hereditary monarch, is that the people that lived within that sovereign border began to make demands and win demands. And this fundamentally changed the role of the state from a mechanism via which to maintain the integrity and power of those who exercised power to a mechanism, to an institution which began to look after the interests of the common people. And that's what the age of reform and revolution was all about. It was about changing, causing a dramatic change in the way the sovereign nation state worked and who its responsibilities were to. Its responsibilities were not only to the monarch or the dictator or the leader, but its responsibilities were to the people it ruled. After World War II, especially in Western Europe and other parts of the world, we saw the introduction of reforms to ensure that people had access to the basic necessities. They were paid a fair wage if they were wage earners, or if they were small business owners, they made a fair profit. They were able to exist free from the threat of external invasion and, more importantly, the arbitrary exercise of state power. Over the last 45 years, possibly 50 years, we've seen a fundamental shift in the role of the state. A fundamental shift. And in many regards, we have moved back to the 19th century, not in terms of showing allegiance to a hereditary monarch, but in terms of showing allegiance to people who exercise power and have wealth. And this has been done through a variety of ways. And the most important way has been the outsourcing of the state's responsibility to provide for its citizens to the private sector. And that's the key, outsourcing to the private sector. And many of the problems which were exposed by the PricewaterhouseCoopers scandal highlight how far that outsourcing has gone. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic, although it continues to reap its victims, but at the height of the pandemic, when there are no vaccinations and no treatments, no access to antivirals, the fact was that the public service, which theoretically provides services to the public on behalf of the state, was a total shambles and was actually not able to address the issue. Because to a significant degree, public services at the local, state and federal level have become nothing more than organisations which outsource the state's responsibility to its citizens to the private sector. And this outsourcing of its responsibility goes way beyond the privatisation of public assets. Way beyond the privatisation of public assets. It now incorporates the private provision of services which were provided by the state to its citizens. Fundamental services like access to water, access to energy, access to security. Fundamental ideas which no longer hold sway in this privatised economy. It's got to such a degree that we now spend billions of dollars hiring private companies to provide advice to governments that they want to hear. Because when that advice came from a paid professional public service, sometimes the government got advice it didn't want to hear. So this outsourcing of responsibility is at the heart of the very reason so many people in the 21st century find themselves in such a difficult situation. Not just in terms of accessing essential services, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's security, but also accessing the very mechanisms via which the state provides these services. The robo-debt fiasco was a lesson in what happens when the private sector is given the sole responsibility for delivering government services. We see it in the unemployed sector, where privately owned organisations, some for profit, some not for profit, some religious based, some not religious based, receive billions of dollars for running the unemployment service, where in the past we had a department which dealt with that situation. Now, we have been told constantly that the outsourcing of public services to the private sector improves outcomes and saves money. The reverse follows. Look at the fiasco regarding energy prices currently. Australia is the second largest exporter of gas in the world. It has access to some of the most extensive mineral resources on the planet. And over the next few months we will see a dramatic increase in energy prices and energy reliability, because these essential services have been privatised, and the privatisation of these essential services has not improved services, has not improved responsibility, and has not resulted in a decrease in prices. And we see it again in the public service. For example, the current housing crisis can be laid at the feet of government policies which many states in the Federation of Australia have seen the privatisation of the public housing sector and the creation of a whole new tier of privately owned organisation masquerading as social community, inclusive, affordable housing, providing housing to people who cannot enter the private market, residential private marketplace. And although billions of dollars has been poured into these privately owned organisations, some for profit, some not for profit, some religious based, some not religious based, we see that nothing ever seems to change, because an increasing amount of government dollars, taxpayers' money, which is given to the private sector to provide services which should have been supplied by government, is wasted in terms of administration costs and profitability. Nothing highlights this disaster more than the privatisation of the aged care sector, where Royal Commission after Royal Commission has highlighted the inadequacies of allowing the private sector to squeeze a profit out of service delivery for aged people. So there are many things the public sector does much better than the private sector. The privatisation of water has been an environmental disaster, as well as disaster for a lot of smaller farms which have gone out of business. And we see this problem occurring over and over and over again. Initially, you privatise essential services. Then you privatise the provision of essential services, and you call it progress. Then you privatise the very heart of the public service, allowing the private sector to determine and drive government policy which ultimately benefits it and nobody else. Because see, capitalism is about private investment for private profit. Why put the fox in the chook pen? We all know how foxes react in a chook pen, and it's the same when you put the private sector into areas of human need where you cannot derive a profit, where you need the collective wealth of the community through the taxation system to actually provide those services. And putting the fox in the chook pen in the aged care sector, the healthcare sector, early childhood development sector is a recipe for disaster. So now we are seeing the reverse of what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. We are seeing the state divest itself of its responsibility to its citizens, divest itself of its responsibility to provide internal security for its citizens. It's one thing to talk about providing security for sovereign borders when those borders basically ensure that those who have wealth and those who exercise power will continue to expand their wealth and will continue to expand their powers at the expense of the community. So do we really want to go back to the 19th century when the private investment for private profit mantra was all the rage, where 4-year-olds worked in coal mines, where people didn't have access to healthcare and they died in their millions, where there was no education, where the elderly welcomed winter as a relief from their misery because they would die of chest infections during that period. And that's what we're looking at today. I know it sounds melodramatic, but ultimately, what is the state for? Is the state there to protect a particular geographical location for that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? Or is it there to provide services and internal and external security for its citizens and permanent residents? This is an issue we should be wrestling with in the 21st century. Public interest before corporate interest is about putting the interests of the public, that's everyone, before the interests of a minuscule, powerful minority, and allowing the state to become a plaything of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication will ensure that we will continue to have the same problems and we will continue not to be able to deal with these problems, although we live in one of the richest parts of the world.